And we're back. Thank you so much for tuning in with us wherever you are and however you may be joining us. You have found the Mike and Mike podcast as we continue on just bantering and talking about biblical truths and trying to find some deep lessons that we can learn from some things that we've studied and discussed. As always, my esteemed colleague, Michael Ray, is joining us from Somerset. Michael, how's everything down in your world?
All is well. Thank you. It's good to be here. I think we weren't exactly sure where we were going to go with this conversation, but in our we made it sound very professional last week when you said we had a pre-pod meeting or whatever you called it. Yeah, in our pre-pod meeting, I thought this went really well. So let's see.
Yeah, we are. And I'm going to steal your phrase from last week since I've gotten some feedback on it this week, but the non-feltboard version of some of these Old Testament stories is what we've been doing. We've called the idea not flawless, where we go back and look at some Bible characters that their story. When you get there, the story, the punchline. But so often we miss some of the details that add depth to these characters and quite honestly make them real. What I love about the scriptures are that they're honest about the righteousness that sometimes characters display, as well as the wickedness that's waiting behind the door, which, if we're honest with ourselves, that's all of us, right? Some days we're good guys and we're good people. Other days we're scumbags. And if our life story was written somewhere in the New Testament or the Old Testament, all of our good and bad would be exposed. And that's what we're trying to talk with today. Tonight, we've got a character that you know well, but he's a little different, and we're going to push back a little bit. But Lot, that we find in the Old Testament, in the New Testament, he's described in a couple different places as righteous Lot, and Lot is seen as righteous. The Holy Spirit inspired writers term Lot as righteous, but oftentimes we know, the punchline of the story is his family's in Sodom and Gomorrah, and they're beating on the door trying to get the angels to bring him out, and his wife looks back, turns to a pillar of salt, and things start to go sideways from there. So there's a lot here. There's a lot that is not feltboard appropriate. I will say that we're going to kind of touch on those, but understand, while we're going to go a little beyond feltboard, we're going to at least keep it to PG-13 because our two most loyal listeners go by the name of Mom. It's going to be a little embarrassing for us to talk about some of this stuff, but we're at least going to take a shot at it. So, Michael, give us the 30,000-foot overview of who Lot is and where he fits in the biblical canon.
And we learned, there's definitely some non-feltboard stuff here. The town wanting to sexually assault angels is not. I've never seen that in the children's book. So yeah,
I'm not sure how you would do that on a feltboard either.
There's some wild stuff happening, but we learn in Genesis chapter 11 that Lot is Abraham's nephew, and we also learn that his father Haran has died. And so as we move through the subsequent chapters, Genesis 11, 12, 13, and again, think about how early in Bible history we are here. We're just a couple of chapters removed from the flood. So we're very, very early on in Bible history, but because they are close relatives and Abraham is his uncle, and because his father's died, it does appear that, at first they both go with Abram's father to the land of Haran and settle there. But then when Abram's father dies, it seems very much that Abram has taken Lot under his wing, so to speak, and has taken care of him since his father has died. And so Abraham and Lot are traveling together, and there's some wild adventures in chapters 12, 13, 14. They're kind of outside the scope of the pod tonight, but I think the story that everyone is familiar with, and maybe a good place to start, because everything else that happens in Lot's life, the hinge kind of turns here on this account, where we see in Genesis 13 where Abram and Lot separate, and this is the feltboard story, right? That this is the story about the generosity and the humility of Lot, that he allows the generosity and humility of Abram, that he allows Lot to look around and choose which direction that they want to go. The story goes that both of them had accumulated so much wealth and herds that their herdsmen were quarreling. This town wasn't big enough for the both of them, so to speak, and so they decided to separate. And I'm just going to read a couple of verses here, Mike, to kind of set up the conversation. This is a story we well know, but I think there is an important point here, and it kind of leads to other stuff. Abraham said to Lot, "Let there be no strife between you and me and between our herdsmen. We are kinsmen. The whole land is before us. Separate yourself from me. If you take the left, I'll take the right. If you take the right, I'll go to the left." And Lot lifted up his eyes and saw the Jordan Valley, that it was well watered everywhere, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt, in the direction of Zoar. And Lot chose for himself this Jordan Valley, and Lot journeyed east, and they separated. Abram settled in the land of Canaan. Lot settled him in the cities of the valley and moved his tent as far as Sodom. And then we get this kind of ominous foreshadowing in verse 13 of Genesis 13. Now the men of Sodom were wicked, great sinners against the Lord. So somewhat unclear maybe in that verse if Lot knew that exactly, but we do see that come into play, that Lot had this very important decision to make, and the decision literally affected the rest of his life and his family's life.
So there's a couple things I want to pinpoint out there. One, it appears that they are wildly successful together, right? They are, every bit of, Jobs and Wozniak or Hewlett and Packard or, whatever, kind of team joint ventures we can think of in our present day. And I also think it's very interesting that the way that they looked at this was not necessarily troubling for either one of them. To Abraham's statement, he said, the whole land is before us. Like, boys, we can be successful anywhere. If you want to go right, I'll go left. You go left, I'll go right. But neither one of them was concerned about what laid ahead, which I think says a lot about their faith and their relationship in God, and the fact that they had been blessed so far and continue to grow and grow and grow. But now that they're, kind of herdsmen are competing for one another and you've got some issues there, they separate. But, Michael, let's try to boil this down into our terms. I don't think we've got a whole lot of agricultural listeners that's out here to our podcast, but how do you make the decision as he's looking off, at the horizon? What goes into making this decision if you are a early biblical history herdsman? How do you make that call as to go right or left?
Yeah, and this is the same decision that families are faced with routinely in our day and time. Families that you have talked to, families that I have talked to. People make the decision: where is the best place? Where is the best job prospects for me and my family? Which I have these two job opportunities. Which one should I take? Which one's going to be better for my family? It's pretty clear from Lot's reaction to Abraham's offer that this was an economic decision for him. He saw that the land was well watered. He saw that it was like the land of Egypt. He saw that the valley was a place where a herdsman, which is what he was, could be prosperous. So it's a decision like lots of people have made. It was an economic decision. This is what's going to be best for my family, and that's the decision he made.
And if we're, so it's easy for us, right? I think this is the other basic tenet of Bible study that's important. It's always easy to play Monday morning quarterback, right? It's easy for us to look at the outcome and to say, Lot, you should have gone the other direction, or you both should have went one direction, or whatever. It's easy for us to say that knowing the outcome, but in the moment, how do you make these decisions knowing that they're economical in nature, knowing that you're looking out for, because who all's Lot's responsible for at this point, Michael?
Yeah, it's a little unclear, but clear. It's obviously he's got a number of employees is probably not exactly the right word, but I'm going to use it. He's got a number of people that are in his employ. He has a number of herds, and it's almost certain that he has some family already with him. We're not clear. I don't know if we know that his daughters have been born yet, but it's clear that he's got some family with him when he goes to Sodom. So this is I think to the point you're making. This wouldn't necessarily be a selfish decision. This is a decision that is made with an eye toward the fact that he is responsible for doing things in the best interest of a number of others.
Yeah, and I mean, he's at least got enough employees that, and again, I'm trying to use our vernacular. He's got enough people that's with his party that they're getting into it with Abraham's people, right? You know, that's the whole reason for the split. It's not that Lot and Abraham are getting into it, or Abram at this point. It's that their herdsmen are fighting and kind of bickering back and forth together. So,
and I think it would be very reasonable to assume that we're not talking about there's two on each side and they can't get along, right? We're talking about a number of herdsmen to the point where it is almost gotten out of Abram and Lot's control.
Right. Yeah. If it's one or two guys, they could sit them down in a tent and say, "Boys, we're going to squash whatever's going on between you." But it's got to be enough to where the reasonable decision is we're going to have to break these herds up. So I think sometimes, again, it's easy for us to say, well, if I was Lot, I would have just carved off a little spot over here, retired comfortably, and wouldn't be worried about all the wealth that I could possibly make going toward the valley here. Really, Lot was trying to find enough space where him and his herdsmen all could prosper, and that all these families could be fed and taken care of and whatnot. So he's not only making a decision for himself, but making a decision for others. We know what he did, but what could he have done differently, Michael?
I think that for me, that answer ultimately goes to what did he know? And if the reputation of Sodom was such that the Bible writer sees fit to indicate that to us before we even get to the account of Lot in Sodom, that this was a renowned place of wicked people, I'm somewhat reluctant to say Lot just went in and was just blindsided. Like he was just he couldn't believe what he got himself into. This was with that kind of reputation, and Abraham and Lot have their own reputation, right? From the things they've been through and the wealth they've accumulated. It's somewhat difficult for me to believe that no emissaries from Sodom had ever interacted with any of Lot's herdsmen. That there's not been any indication to Lot of what he might be getting into.
Well, and back up a couple of chapters. Again, it's hard timelines, right? Because I think sometimes we feel like, chapter 15 happened a couple of days after chapter 14, which happened a couple of weeks after chapter 13. There could be decades in between here. But we know at least at one point, they were involved with the king of Sodom. When Lot got captured and kidnapped and they went on these adventures together, the king of Sodom was involved in that. So maybe, and again, we're talking conjecture here. Maybe Lot expected, because of the previous relationships with the king of Sodom, that he could be left alone. Like, hey, these guys know me and know what I'm about, know what Abraham's about, and we can find a spot on the outskirts of town if the wickedness is prevailing. But the other thought that I had was, if he didn't know, couldn't he have sent a little scouting party out, to go, hey guys, why don't you guys go into Sodom, try and trade or something in Sodom and get us a lay of the land? Because where I go in my mind when I try to make the parallels and comparison is, if I'm offered a job at some remote city of the United States, one of the things that typically we do is, you may fly in for an interview, drive around town and whatnot, but do we spend the time, looking for more of God's people that are there, finding a church family? Is that in the compensation package? Or do we look at the fact that I'm making X, and if I make this move, I'm going to make Y, and therefore I'll figure all the other stuff out? And I think that may be part of this is he's looking at the opportunity and the upside and doesn't consider what the costs could be. Because that's one of the terms, again, you're dealing with an accountant and a financial planner on this. We subscribe to the principle that there's no such thing as a free lunch, that economic principle that there's always going to be a cost associated with whatever gains you have. So if you haven't counted the cost, if you haven't figured the cost, if you haven't analyzed the cost and figured out whether or not it's worth the risk to the gain, I think that may be where he's lacking a little bit here too.
Agreed. And back to your earlier point, I think based on what we know about Sodom, if he had sent a couple of herdsmen and say, hey, go spend the night in Sodom in the town square and see how that, I think he would have found out quite quickly what Sodom was all about. It's almost too perfect of a parallel, right? I mean, it's almost too on the nose that God is telling us through this story. It's like, hey, watch yourself when you are moving your family to a new geographic area for economic reasons. I mean, it's almost too on the nose.
Right. And here's my pushback. Lot's still righteous making this decision, right? It's not as if, and I think sometimes we get down to this of, if you're going into this situation, you're doing it for economics and the family and all that stuff, that may become a moral conversation. Well, it's wrong for you to take this job. It wasn't necessarily wrong, right? Lot is still called righteous. But what we find by the time we get to chapter 19 and what's going on there, we've got, them beating down the doors for the angels, Lot offering up his daughters, and that whole, again, we don't have time to get into the minutia of all of that. But you know what else I find extraordinary, Michael? There's what? How many of them was there? Was there 6, 8 that are found? It wasn't 10 righteous, right? Wasn't that the bargain that Abram struck up? So think about all these herdsmen that are with Lot right now, enough that they're fighting with Abram's herdsmen. They've been under their influence. I would argue that they're probably fairly righteous when they were with Abram and Lot. Now, after some years in the city, some years in the plain here, his herdsmen are nowhere to be found when we're counting righteous people. So I also find that extraordinary.
Yeah, he lost spiritually. He lost some of his family, and it appears on all of his employees, all of his coworkers. I would question the conversation about was this a righteous decision. And I think the whole premise of our study here is that righteous people can make lousy decisions. That's kind of the whole point. And so I don't think that we can go to, and what is the verse? I was just looking at it. I don't think we can go to 2 Peter, and I'll read the verse just so we can have it in our memory. 2 Peter 2:7, and say, and if he rescued righteous Lot, greatly distressed by the sensual conduct of the wicked. I don't think we can go to that verse. Oh, it's righteous Lot, and therefore we can extrapolate from that. These decisions must not have been poor decisions. They were just a righteous person who made a decision and got put into the wrong spot. I mean, again, our whole series of studies here is that righteous people can make pretty cruddy decisions, and I think I would argue that's kind of what Lot did here. Now, can bad decisions be made with good intentions? Absolutely, with very defensible, on the surface, very defensible ideas. Was this about greed, or was it just about responsibility to take care of the people that was with him? That's a very defensible thing. I've got a family to support. I've got people that are traveling with us. I got coworkers to support, and yet, I mean, if you just judge it like you judge a racehorse, judge it by performance, that was a lousy decision.
Right.
So righteous Lot made a lousy, ungodly decision that cost him his family. Now, the really incredible thing there is that he's still righteous Lot, in my judgment. So what Peter goes on to say in verse 8, it says, that righteous man lived among them day after day. He was tormenting his righteous soul over their lawless deeds that he saw and heard. So both of these things can be true, and that's what's remarkable. He put himself in that situation, and yet he's righteous Lot at the end of it.
And I think that's really what I'm driving at here. And I think what's incredible about this is, to your point, that righteous people, even when they're righteous at the end, right? If again, back to your analogy, you judge a racehorse by how it finished, well, he finished righteous. Now, did he also up his degree of difficulty in maintaining that righteousness? Absolutely, right? He went into the viper's pit, and it says very clearly that his righteousness was vexed every day by the things that were going on. And yet, here's the other thing that's extraordinary here is that we can make the best decisions with defensible points and be reasonable and convince ourselves and convince our family and maybe convince people that love us around us when we're making these decisions, and it still be the wrong decision. Because what I find is that's absolutely extraordinary is, yes, was he rescued? And does Peter make that point about him being rescued and Abram and all that? But why didn't he leave earlier? I mean, at what point, when you watch herdsman after herdsman, family after family continue to fall away, that you get to the point where there's not 10 of you that are righteous to get out of the city, because God would have spared the whole city for 10. We couldn't come up with 10 righteous people. And your wife was at least having mixed feelings on this. I mean, she's righteous, but she ends up in the pillar of salt on the way out when she turns back to look at the city for whatever reason. And that's a whole nother, can of snakes to get through of why she looked back and what she was looking for and all that stuff. But, at the end of the day, we can put ourselves in very difficult positions, maintain our righteousness, but at what cost? At what cost do we have mental, emotional, spiritual toll to maintain that? And those of you that have heard me preach from time to time know that I use this analogy of our faith like a bucket with a hole in it. That, every day we do things to try to fill that bucket up with the water of faith, but just the rub of the day, there's a small enough hole in the bottom of that bucket that some of our faith is leaving out. But what Lot just did is he just drilled a big old hole in the bottom of it. To what he would have to do for his faith every day just to maintain neutral became a chore, and it vexed his righteousness having to deal with that. So the question that we've got to come back to as serious Bible students and as leaders of families and as those that are in these decisions are we truly counting all of the cost and the decisions that we're making, even when we make them defensible?
Yeah. Do you think that having to make the decision to offer your daughters to a immoral crowd wanting to sexually assault someone would vex your righteous soul? Yeah. I mean, what?
And quite honestly, that's the best decision. Like, that's what you're left to. It's either the angels that you're protecting, those visitors overnight, whether he knew they were angels or not, different story. But those visitors, those strangers, those foreigners that you're protecting, that your next best bet to protect them is to sacrifice the daughters. What kind of position do you get into where that's your two choices? And how vexing is that's the two choices that you're left with? And I think, when we put when we struggle, when we have sufferings, when we have persecution, part of the question we need to ask ourselves is, what role did we play in putting ourselves in that spot? Did we kind of dig this hole before we fell into it? And if we can't go back and trace that and look at the missteps we made along the way, then we're doomed to repeat them again.
And if you want the murky water on Lot's morality to get even murkier, you go to the end of chapter 19, where he manages to impregnate both of his daughters. That there is not a felt board version of that particular little encounter. And um, and yet righteous Lot was vexed. Um, so this is a pretty extreme example, and I think God gives us extreme examples at times. It's pretty clear Lot made some really bad choices, and choices that corrupted and ultimately probably cost him his family. Um, just because Lot ended the race being called righteous, I don't think that he would he do it the same way? Like that's almost that's kind of a dumb question, right?
Yeah,
Okay,
I
there's
love.
there's any choice that, like, we always say, well, if you make it to heaven, if you make it to heaven, then you won. And I understand that point, and I agree with it in a lot of ways. But if you make a choice that costs you your entire family and all of your associates and everything that you know, and you survive, what is the writer, what does Jude say, like clothes, smelling like fire or snatched from the fire? Like, would you make those exact same decisions? Like, are we like so I think that's kind of an interesting thing to think about also.
Well, and there's so much to dig through there too. I mean, he's got at one point, virgin daughters, right, that he's sacrificing. A few verses earlier, right, to the crowd that's banging outside the door, but they end up so depraved in their way of thinking that they're willing to get their father drunk and sleep with them to further the cause. That their moral compass and moral line has gotten skewed here,
No question.
but they believe is righteous. But they had to be righteous enough. Remember, that was the bargain with Abram and God, right? We need 10 righteous souls, and we got to, the 5 or 6 of them, however many words they were leaving town. But they were counted among those that were allowed to leave as righteous to escape from that. And yet those wounds are still lasting. I think that we have to be honest with ourselves when we put ourselves in certain situations. While we may come out, righteous on the other side of it, what stains have we brought back with us? What, virus have we brought back to the camp that's going to infect the rest of the family? Because you don't go through all those things completely unscathed. And what about the events and situations that we put our families in? Ultimately Lot's responsible for those, right? Because he's the head of the household making decisions. And yet there still is, and that's the other side of this that's important, there still is the personal accountability, right? Their sins were not counted toward Lot. The herdsmen that fell away aren't laid at Lot's feet. The wife that was pillar of salt's not laid at Lot's feet. The daughters and their bad decisions aren't laid at Lot's feet. Lot's righteous, but there's a lot of carnal damage in Lot's path.
And so, what do you tell really good, strong, believing people who are in unholy places?
My advice is count the cost. And be honest with yourself about what it's costing you to be in said unholy place. And while do I believe it's possible, and pick a place, Las Vegas, I think it's possible for there to be Christians in Las Vegas. Absolutely. I think it's possible. Do I think you've upped your degree of difficulty to be involved with the things that go around there? Yeah, I do. I think it's going to be harder when when you're known as Sin City and that's how you do your tourism advertising. But I don't, I'm picking on Vegas, but I mean, choose some of these cities around the world and other countries and other places where, debauchery is the name of the day. And I think what you find is the warning to the church in Thyatira in Revelation, or the warning to some of these churches that ended up compromising in their communities, and instead of maintaining righteousness, the righteousness after being beat on for a while gets through. So the question is, kind of, have you counted the cost, and do you have options? That's the thing that is amazing about the country that we live in, is we're mobile. if you don't like where you're at, there's nothing that's stopping you from picking up and moving from, central Kentucky to California or New York or Florida or anywhere else. I mean, there's mobility here, and you have choices. You're not necessarily tied, but it's a decision that every family has to make. And, can I also, on the other side of the coin, say to really strong, brother or sister that's in one of those spots that what you're doing is going to cost you your soul, or you can't be righteous here? No, because Lot could. It was just hard.
Yeah. I, I, I think that's a hard one. I'm trying to think how to formulate a response there. Christianity got a foothold in Rome, and um, and in some other places that in Corinth, and was pretty strong in Corinth. And uh, I think that's a really hard thing. Do we want all of the good people to abandon these difficult areas?
And,
And
and, and maybe there's also something of that strength in numbers too, right? If there's not 10 of you in a city, maybe it's time to cut bait.
Yeah, and now I think that's fair. You know, there's a really strong congregation in Las Vegas. I got good friends. I got good friends there,
Yeah.
and there's a community of believers that are shining light there. I think knowing real people in that scenario makes this theoretical conversation a little less theoretical, and those are really hard. Those are really hard choices.
No, absolutely. And let's be very clear here. And again, if you've been in Bible class with me or heard me from the pulpit, everything is easy academically, right? Michael and I can talk about this very, very easily on a podcast, right? We live in central Kentucky. We're not making this decision. It's a whole lot different when you got a mortgage and property and a good job and all of those things, family roots and ties. And look, it's again perfectly easy academically, very, very hard practically. And that's the thing with this is, I've said oftentimes that, the gospel and the decisions that we make as Christians are simple. They're not easy. They're simple. They're just not easy.
And perhaps tying this back to Lot, if we want to kind of wrap up this part of it, what makes Lot's situation really unique is he did have a choice, right? Mm-hmm. And he had a pretty clear choice, a choice that did not come with any real short-term costs. Like he could have made the decision to the right hand just as easy as the left, and they cost him the same, at least in terms of the initial move. So I think that does make it a little unique, choosing that step rather than looking around and saying, with our brothers here, is this the right place to be? That's one question, but should we seek that out is something a little different, perhaps.
Yeah, and that's more where I am with these opportunities, and we've had them, come to Danville, where people have been moved with their job or potentially could be moved, and they're interviewing, and they come and they worship with us, and we've got 2 or 3 families there right now that will tell you the reason they accepted the job was they had a church family in Danville that they could lean on. And I think that's important if you do the investigation to find that versus, do you go somewhere and you can't find any of the Lord's people and you still make the move, right? And you make it, we'll just start a church here. We'll do this or we'll do that. I mean, again, good intentions that may create difficulty that you haven't foreseen.
And what a depressing thought it would be that Christians would make an economic choice and go through the entire process and then discover that there wasn't a place that they were comfortable worshiping. Mm-hmm. And I know of those stories that that unfortunately says something about the priority, about prioritization. And listen, that's that is not a what's the right thing to say? That that's not said to be judgmental or to be mean, but it just does kind of speak to that.
Yeah, and it's one of those hard truths that we have to be honest with ourselves about. And I think that becomes the most difficult piece of all of this. You know, did Lot at some point, laying awake in bed at night, hearing what's going on outside, ever consider, maybe me and, the wife and the girls should try to hook back up with Abram? And maybe there was some, pride or reluctance or whatever to go hat in hand back and say, hey, I made this move and it didn't pan out well. Now it seems very clear from Abram's interceding with God, they'd have welcomed him back with open arms, probably staked him if he had to, right? Hey, you got out of there and didn't leave with any herd, let me spot you some and you can try to turn these things over and rebuild. If Abram's willing to bargain with God over Lot's soul and the cities, what wouldn't he have done? And I think maybe sometimes that's part of the problem too, is our own pride or whatever gets in the way. And, we're afraid to say, look, I made a bad call here. I probably shouldn't have made this move. And, we need to try to do something else rather than live with the consequences.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. And obviously there is some subjectivity here where we are reading into the text, but could it be possible that Lot didn't think those things? If he's a righteous person and his soul is being vexed every day by what he sees around him, like if he's truly righteous, he's spending time thinking about how to get out of this.
Mm-hmm.
There's no question that he is. And you wonder about the pride factor.
And you wonder too, and again, we completely reading into the text here. So give us a little bit of rope, but you wonder too, if he felt on some level he was making an impact, that, people are seeing the example of me and my family and how we're not involved in this. And maybe there's some folks that are at least showing some mild interest, not enough to righteous, right? Because we don't have the righteous people in there, but maybe, at least he felt in his mind or in his heart that there were a few that were close, and maybe he was sticking it out, whether it be to, protect or influence them or whatever. I'm trying to put myself in that situation to say, why do you hang on with the soul being vexed? And maybe that's part of it. Maybe he thought, he was all that was between Sodom and Gomorrah's falling, not knowing that they were a couple souls light.
And so let's end on this one, and I'll let you answer it. You're in that scenario. We're all in that scenario to some extent. We're just not necessarily in the middle of Sodom, but I'm becoming more convinced we're in the middle of Babylon.
Or at least Rome.
How do you know if you're having an influence on the culture, if the culture's having an influence on you?
That, my friend, is the $1 million question. I think that we all have to be honest and struggle with, of, what part of this are we, and I'm, borrowing heavy from Revelation because I'm teaching a class on it right now. But, the two biggest conflicts we see in the 7 churches of Asia Minor are, some are facing heavy persecution and some are facing heavy complacency and acceptance, where they've watered down the gospel to become more like those that are around us. And, I use this goofy analogy all the time about that, because nobody wants to believe that they're a follower. But, the correct answer is, all of us that are listening to this podcast, pick up your high school yearbook and look how you used to dress. Like, none of that looked good. If you were in the 70s and you wore, zoot suits and big goofy curly hair, that looked goofy. Everybody knows that. But we all did it. because that's what everybody else did and what everybody else looked like. And we, as much as we know we're supposed to be different and we're supposed to be salt and light and all that, the last thing any of us really want to do is stand out in a crowd. We really don't. We want to kind of be like other people around us. We don't want to be strange and different and weird. None of us kind of want to be that. And even if you look at the, counterculture movements, Michael and I grew up in the 90s, and, we had the golf kids that all looked exactly alike golf, not wanting to look like everybody else, but they found a bunch of other people that looked just like them and dressed a certain way and listened to a certain kind of music and all that. So we do that from time to time. And I think, especially what, I've seen over my short lifetime is that, there are certain things that are okay and acceptable now in our lives that wouldn't have been 25, 30 years ago. Whether we talk about, modesty, or whether we talk about, language, or whether we talk about certain aspects that we put ourselves into, that it doesn't sting like it once would. It's not, there's a lot more acceptance along a few things, which, there's some of that is it creeping into, and we're, our moral compass was here and now it's kind of down here because everybody else is even further lower. Are we, just kind of keeping a margin above what everybody else's morality is? But as their morality level drops, our margin drops in time with it. I don't know. But it's definitely something, I can point to a few things like that are just, different at this point. And rightly or wrongly, did we, have things moved too far one way or another? I guess time judges that more so than I can. But I think that's a fear that we all have to have, of, are we lowering our standards because society has lowered theirs even further?
Yeah. I mean, we are being influenced by our culture, right? I think that's the point you're making. I mean, you got on an Under Armour shirt and I've got on Under Armour pants as we speak.
Mm-hmm.
We didn't make that choice because we researched 35 different polo shirts and this was the one that had the thread count that most was suitable to our particular, like, we chose it because it looked cool and Jordan Spieth wore it or whatever, it and probably not that overtly, way more subconsciously than that. But like, we chose our glasses because these are the style of glasses that people are wearing, like in any number of ways. And so in the ways that really matter, is it happening?
Mm-hmm.
That's what should keep us as husbands and fathers and deacons up at night.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And how we're, like you said, to how that needle's moving. I mean, is it things that matter or don't? And, when we get into, things that the Bible specifically is warning about, sexual immorality and modesty and things like that. I mean, are we moving that line as well? Because now society has moved it. And, but I don't want to be the guy that this is the worst times that there are.
Of course not.
Because I'm 100% a student of history, and I can take you back along the bell curve of history and show you where it was a lot worse. I mean, if Paul has to openly write about bestiality in Romans chapter 1, I don't think we're there yet. I don't think if, Paul's writing a letter to the church at Danville or the church at Somerset, bestiality is high on the list of things to talk about, but it wasn't wrong. And you've got, Aristotle and Plato and Socrates that openly discussed pedophilia as part of grooming a young man to become a philosopher. We're not there yet. Are we going to be there in a decade or 2 or 3 or 5? I don't know. But it seems like we go through periods throughout history where things get pretty loose morally before some catastrophic event, whether that be the, bubonic plague or the Dark Ages or, the different things that happen in time. And we have, Reformation movements and restoration movements and enlightenment and periods where people come back to God. So is this part of just some deeper cycle? Maybe. But the question we all have to ask ourselves is, for me in my house, where do we stand?
Yeah, did Lot think he was being influenced? If you interviewed Lot 3 weeks later, would he have been shocked that his wife turned around? Would he have been shocked that he himself lingered? We read in the text. Would he have been shocked at the fact that none of his herdsmen came with him, and that his daughters were influenced the way they were? And yeah, I think
I would love to
that's
have
interesting.
I would love to have Lot's conversation with Pharaoh like we had Jacob's, right? When asked, if somebody here in the text asked him about his life, how would Lot look back? Remember in our conversation a couple of weeks ago about Jacob, that he said to Pharaoh, long and miserable have been the days of my life. And all of the things that he had done, what he had sowed, he definitely reaped in his lifetime, in pain and torment and being tricked over some things. I wonder if we had, Lot's Ecclesiastes or Lot's conversation with Pharaoh, how much insight we'd have into what this torment really looked like.
Beware the well-watered valleys of Zoar, wherever you may find them. This got darker than usual. We're typically optimistic, but maybe next week.
Definitely. We'll work through a little bit better next time. Let's put a quick bow on this. Lessons from tonight are, to Michael's point, beware where we're pitching our tents and how well the water looks on the other side and who else it's attracting. I think that's important. I think it's important for us to even though we're in, and this is another point that we hit that I hope you don't walk away without, is that even when you're in a defensible position that you feel really good about, doesn't make it right and doesn't make it the best decision. And maybe that's it, that even when sometimes it's not a right and wrong decision, there's a best decision that could be made. And it may not be the economic decision. It may be something else. But when we go through these situations, these difficulties, these trials, especially when we put ourselves in them, we don't come out unscathed. And I think that's something that we've got to be mindful of as opportunities are presented to us. The big job in the foreign city or far city may not necessarily be from God. And I think, sometimes we want to make that tie that we've been praying about this and God's opened this door, but maybe it's temptation instead of the Lord. And maybe a little soul searching can help us find out the right answer there.
Yeah, that question and the question of what kind of influence is the culture having on me, those take a ton of discernment. They take a ton of prayer. They take good accountability partners. They take a community of people that care about you and are watching out for you as well. So all that stuff's critical.
Yeah, that and I'm gonna throw one more in that we didn't talk about, but bonus point here. Never underestimate the value of people that love you, that are praying for you and watching out for you. Because without Abram, Lot probably doesn't make it out alive. And Abram's prayers and intercessions with God to save his nephew is powerful. And I think there's a lot of us that are out there surviving on the prayers of people that love us. And that's a huge blessing that we ought to be thankful for.
Well said, my man.
All right. Again, thank you for tuning in with us. Thank you for being with us, however you are finding us and wherever you are at this phase of your life. We hope we've given you some things to think about. Hope we've challenged you a little bit. And even though a little darker than we normally are, hopefully it's beneficial in your life and your spiritual journey. Till next time, my friend.
See you, buddy.